Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Holly McPhail with the Florida League of Cities, and we are glad that you've joined us. For those of you who are here, you should see on your screen the first opening slide, how to create a crisis plan. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll have what we call our audience participation dashboard. You might call it a navigation panel, whatever you want to call it, but you'll notice near close to the bottom that there are handouts available for you. That's actually a copy of the slide presentation if you want to go ahead and download those now and have them available at your desk so that you're able to take notes as we go along. Immediately above that, there is a place for you to ask questions. So if you want to submit questions, you can type that in and we will answer them near the end of the session. There's also a chat function, so if you want to communicate with folks within the group here, send me a direct message, feel free to use that chat function. With that, I would like to introduce our two speakers today. We have Michelle Ubin, who is a partner with the Sachs Media Group, as well as the Vice President of Public Relations, Mr. John Peck. And with that, I will turn it over so that they can introduce the topic and themselves as our experts.
Hi, I'm Michelle Ubin, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. This is the third webinar that we've put on as part of the FLCityGuard educational series. And I very much appreciate your time today and being with us to discuss how to and why to put together a crisis plan for your city. I spent 14 years in state government as a communication director before joining Sachs Media Group, and have been with Sachs for nearly 20 years. In that time, I've handled quite a few crises for different government agencies and for clients who came to us in crisis, but I've also spent a lot of time working with clients to put crisis plans together and get ahead of a crisis by making sure they're prepared for it. And I can tell you from experience that's the better position to be in. I'd like to ask my colleague John Peck to tell you a little bit about his background, and we've had the opportunity to work a few crises together over the years.
That we have. Good afternoon, everyone. I am John Peck. I also have pretty extensive experience working with crises from really all vantage points. I started out my career as a newspaper reporter. I then spent about 26 years working for state government in various capacities, all involved with communications at the highest levels of state government, including 4 years as a governor's press secretary, and that kind of job is basically your crisis a day. And then for the last 4.5 years, I've been at Sachs Media Group and worked a number of crisis situations to help our clients, including several Florida cities, through situations where they need a little extra help. And we're delighted to be able to provide some guidance to you today and help you make sure that the next crisis that you come across won't be one that you can't handle.
Just to reiterate what Holly said, we will be answering your questions at the end, so I would encourage you to jot down your questions or share them on the chat feature, and we will make sure that all your questions are answered and are looking forward to a good dialogue with you about those topics. You know, sadly, you only have to watch the evening news to see that a crisis is not a matter of if it ever strikes, but really a matter of when. We live in a time where there is a lot of uncertainty, in some cases even chaos that can afflict the city, and the importance of having a crisis plan in place is that it gives you a much better chance to come through the crisis with your city's reputation intact, and most importantly, to give your constituents what they need in the way of information and direction, and to be able to assert authority. I know a lot of people will say, well, we do this for a living. We know how to deal with the media. We know how to put out communication messages to our constituents. We know how to coordinate with other agency partners. Why do we need to put it down in a formal plan? But I will tell you that taking the time to think through what a crisis might look like, what the steps to properly respond to that would be, to put your media list together, to think through who your crisis team is, all the things we'll be talking about today, puts your city in a much stronger position. It allows you to move more quickly. It allows you to coordinate and have fewer missteps or drop balls. It enhances your trust among the public and the sense that you are in control and are the trusted source of information. So again, I applaud you for taking the time to learn how to put a crisis plan together, and I hope that you will, after this, look at the resources available to you on the CityGuard website and put a crisis plan in place for your cities. So what do we mean, what constitutes a crisis? There are, of course, external crises that can hit a city out of the blue, a natural disaster like a hurricane, for instance, or perhaps physical damage, a bridge that collapses, or you know, a road that's damaged. They may be threats to public safety or public health. Maybe the drinking water supply is compromised, or maybe there's a Zika virus outbreak in your city. All of those are crises that are out of your control, but once they hit, then you need to manage them and get information out in an orderly way. There also are what we sometimes call self-inflicted crises. You know, mishandling an external crisis can suddenly become an internal crisis when your leadership is questioned for not responding quickly enough or appropriately when there is a natural disaster. A personal issue can blow up into a crisis that needs to be handled on many levels, or perhaps a personnel issue within your city. We've seen all too often that inflammatory communication, text messages, emails that say volatile things can blow up into a national or even international story. You only have to watch the Democratic National Convention to see the most recent example of that. And even public policy can become a crisis if the policy ends up being so wildly unpopular that it provokes controversy or provokes protests, for instance. One of the things that we would encourage you to do, and we will provide some CityGuard resources to help you do this, is to, in your plan, decide what the levels of activation are for these types of crisis. You might have a level 1, level 2, level 3 system, and define what those constitute and what steps you would take at each level. So for instance, a level 1 crisis might involve just a small number of residents or visitors. It may be that the communication manager or director would be able to handle that individually with coordination with city leadership, and and it may not go any further than that. A level 2 crisis might be defined as something that affects a significant or sizable portion of the population, maybe under 10%, and it might include a minor public health or safety concern, or an issue where some loss of life or serious injury was involved. It may also involve significant interest by the media, whereas a level 3 crisis perhaps might involve as much as a third or more of the population, and could involve national media interest. At a level like that, the entire crisis team that we'll discuss on this webinar would probably need to be activated, and the city manager and mayor would probably be deeply involved in managing a crisis like that.
Now, we're talking, of course, about crises, but for today, our focus is on crisis communications. We're not going to try to tell you how to deploy your police personnel or what other resources ought to be located anywhere. But from a communications perspective, the goal in any crisis is the same, and it seems fairly obvious on the surface, and that is to avoid damage to your city's brand. But that's so much more than just a PR wish list. Obviously, you don't want bad press, but the reason you don't want it is because damaging your city's brand can have a number of other implications that can do more tangible harm to the city. It can hurt tourism, which obviously would affect your tax revenues, which would affect the services you can provide. It might affect public confidence in the basic structure of government. Any of these things could undermine the ability of city government to do the job it was created to do. And that's why the goal is always to avoid damage to the city's brand. It's not really to make any one individual or group of individuals look good. It's to make sure the city is able to maintain its place in the life of the community. And so as a bit of an overview to where we're going to go over the next several minutes, you can see the slide about getting started. And obviously in trying to put together a plan, you need to understand what your current capabilities are. The capabilities of a major city obviously are going to be different than some of the more rural communities that really are in large number throughout the state. We would really encourage you to check out the FLCityGuard.com website. It's designed specifically for Florida League of Cities members, and it has a number of informative articles covering steps you should take before a crisis, steps you can take during a crisis, and things you can do after the crisis, because once the crisis is over, the crisis response is not. You want to make sure you are able to identify your crisis communications team, which comes down to how high up the chain does it go. Obviously, the person who fills the role of public information officer or communications specialist is going to be a part of this, but also, are you going to have the police chief on your crisis communications team, or someone that's designated to fill his or her role? And the same thing on down the line. What kind of people would you need to utilize for the crisis communications function, separate and apart from the actual tangible on-the-street response? You would need to have some sort of a communications command center. In larger areas, that can often be an emergency operations center. But in other circumstances, that may not be feasible. And so you want to just assess your resources, find a place that would work for the purposes of a command center. You need to establish protocols for handling the crisis. Who speaks to the public? Who speaks to the media on behalf of the city? And how do they get information from the field? All these things need to be carefully considered. And you also want to give some serious thought to what kinds of things could trigger a crisis. And no matter what you think of, there will be something else that can come up that you had not thought of. And anytime something happens in another city, right after you finish counting your blessings that it wasn't in your city, you might want to think about, if that did happen in your town, how would you handle that? So that's a good way to kind of get yourself started on the road toward building a crisis plan.
Clearly, in a crisis, speed is important. You have to get out in front of it. You have to manage it well. But you also have to have an accurate and trustworthy response. The quick response cycle diagram that you see here is a depiction of the quick steps that you need to take to activate a crisis plan. They're the steps that you need to take to communicate with all key audiences. And this is purposely circular because you will continue to adapt your messaging and get information, updated information out as the crisis unfolds. So it starts with verifying the facts, identifying the crisis level, having a really good sense of where it falls and the type of crisis that it is, who needs to be a part of it, and having a handle on the facts as you know it there at the beginning of the crisis. And then activating the team. The benefit of putting the forethought into having a crisis plan is that you don't have to scramble to figure out who the right players are, how you're going to get in touch with them, who needs to be pulled back from vacation. You will have put together, as part of your crisis plan, the key people who need to be activated and what their roles will be, which we'll discuss a little later. And then third, implement. You're going to implement the protocols on the communication front, on the public records front, on the legal front, on the coordination with other agencies. And so thinking through those protocols, having written protocols in place will allow you to avoid skipping any steps or failing to communicate with a key audience. Which brings us to the next part of the quick response cycle, identify. Every crisis is a little different in terms of which audiences need information. Certainly the media is always going to be an essential audience in a crisis, and your constituents in the city certainly would be as well. But depending on the type of crisis, there may be victims and victims' families. There may be the greater law enforcement community that would need different types of messaging and maybe a different messenger. So thinking through, for your particular situation, which audiences need information. And then coordination. Chances are, no crisis happens in a vacuum. There will be implications for the state agencies, for the governor's office. There may even be federal involvement by, environmental agencies or regulatory agencies that that need close coordination in a crisis, and also your sister cities who may be affected by what's going on in your domain. Then the all-important step of communicating. While it's certainly going to have to customize messaging for the particular facts of your crisis, we will show you how having some template messaging in place will allow you to move much more quickly and be sure that you have messaging that covers all the important points that a statement or a press release should cover in a crisis, and then adapting those communications for the different audiences that you've identified. Next, you would distribute that through all appropriate channels, both to the media and to the public, and to any possible partners that you need to coordinate with. And then, very important to monitor what the public reaction is, what the commentary is, and as you know, with social media and a 24/7 news cycle, there are many sources of information that you need to be monitoring very closely throughout the crisis. And then continuing through that circle to share a constant flow of accurate and appropriate information. I think we've all seen leaders at the podium during a painful crisis who have done an exceptional job of saying appropriate words that instill confidence in the people who are listening and make them feel that even in a terrible circumstance they can trust their city leaders. And so what are the elements that a good statement in a crisis should strike? Well, compassion, caring is certainly first and foremost. I think if you think of the most exceptional statements by public leaders that you've heard in a crisis, you may not remember the facts or the details of what was said, but you will remember the emotional tone and whether that leader showed appropriate caring and compassion. That's first and foremost. Secondly, your statement should inspire confidence. People are looking to city leaders for direction. They're looking to know that they are in good hands. And so it's very important that both through your demeanor and through your words, you instill a sense of confidence in the city. Third, confirmation. confirming the facts that you can, the facts that you're aware of. You never want to see you speculate or say more than you know at the time, but establishing that you are the trusted source of information and that you will share the facts as you know it is important to maintaining control of the situation. Then fourth, containment. Explaining the steps that the city is taking to contain the crisis, to keep it from getting out of control, to keep it from getting worse, whether it's a fire or a shooting, the sense that things are under control and you have a plan to contain the damage. Next, coordination, reassuring the public that you are coordinating with all appropriate state and federal agencies and any other appropriate partners in the crisis. Finally, a call to action and correction. Call to action is, here's what you need to do as members of the community. Avoid this road, stay home until the danger is resolved, or stay out of this part of town, or look for somebody who fits this description and call this hotline if you see them. So what is it you need citizens to do in this crisis? And corrective action, reassuring the public at the appropriate time that steps are being taken to make sure this type of crisis doesn't happen again. That may be appropriate in your initial statement, or it may be something that is several statements, several days into the crisis. But at some point, you do want to shift from the crisis to the corrective action. Oh, yes. And now we're going to watch a video that shows Mayor Buddy Dyer during the awful Orlando shooting virtually cover every one of these 7 C's in his statement.
Today we're dealing with something that we never imagined and is unimaginable. Since the last update, we have gotten better access to the building. We have cleared the buildings. And it is with great sadness that I share we have not 20 but 50 casualties. In addition to the shooter, there are another 53 that are hospitalized. Because of the scale of the crime, I've asked the governor to declare a state of emergency. We're also issuing a state of emergency for the city of Orlando so that we can bring additional resources to bear to deal with the aftermath. Our focus is going to be on identifying the victims and notifying the families. We're setting up a hotline for concerned family members.
Okay, the mayor's remarks went on, but in just about a minute's time, you can see that he covered a great number of these 7 C's. He expressed compassion for the victims. Just the picture you're looking at instills confidence in the public that you've got the civil and law enforcement leadership on the job, on the scene, and working it. He confirmed what facts they knew at the time. He also, containment was in the sense of we've been able to get into the building. That tells you that the situation itself is contained, if not the fallout from it. Coordination, he discussed how they'd spoken to the governor's office and the county, and we're looking for states of emergency. Call to action they weren't really at the point yet to ask people to do much, but even if the call to action is essentially remain calm, and that picture is one that's designed to give you, again, that same reassurance, and the corrective action is more a matter of in this case, because this was so soon after the event happened, the corrective action I would suggest was essentially him setting the record straight. He began by saying it's not 20, it's 50. In other words, they found out that some of the information they had put out a little earlier wasn't entirely correct. Sadly, it was much worse than anyone had possibly imagined. But again, here was a case where the mayor was talking from notes, not a carefully crafted statement, but he touched on all the key points that you would want to hit in an early statement to let the public know what the situation is. So now let's turn to some actual specific action steps that go into putting together a plan that would prepare you for dealing with a situation like this. First thing would be to identify your potential vulnerabilities. Again, we're not talking about your response, we're talking about your plan ahead of time. So you want to assess the particulars of your own city. Do you have aging infrastructure? Well, who doesn't? But what are the particular threats? If your particular city has a lot of, for example, bridges, that's a vulnerability that may not exist in a more flat community. If you're at the water, that's going to give you certain vulnerabilities that you don't have. Some of the ones that show on the screen are really every city is vulnerable to it, but each city has its own unique set as well. And that's something you want to take into account. If you are, for example, a college town, the situation is going to be different because the nature of your population is going to be different. These are all things that you want to take into account by identifying your potential vulnerabilities. Then the next step would be to identify and establish your crisis team. You need, again, there's no one-size-fits-all, as I mentioned earlier, but you want to take into account who is going to be in charge of your communications function, who is going to be your spokesman, and you want to make sure you have a backup because so many crises last longer than one 8-hour or even 12-hour shift, and at some point your spokesperson is going to get tired, and tired can lead to errors, and you want to avoid that. So you want to make sure you have round-the-clock coverage on the communications function. You want to factor in what's the law enforcement end of it. Well, you can pull the police chief into your crisis communications team, but that means he or she is potentially not coordinating as effectively as possible with the officers in the field. How are you going to address that? Same thing with, you've always got to make sure that you're dealing with the legal function, the city attorney's office, just so that you know that you're on a solid footing with anything you do. Compliance as well. Certain kinds of crises can implicate, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You need to make sure that you're not taking actions that inadvertently violate some sort of regulation or requirement that you have to meet. You want to decide who will speak for the city. It's important to have an official spokesman, but as you could see in the video we showed, undoubtedly the city of Orlando has a communications director, but it was the mayor who was speaking. And Orlando, of course, is a strong mayor system. If it's not a strong mayor system, is it the mayor who's going to speak, city manager, or someone else? That's something you need to think about before the day of the crisis. And you also need to figure out who's going to make those decisions. All kinds of decisions, including ultimately the decision of what information are we going to make public right now and what is it that's not yet ready to be released. These are all steps that you need to take in establishing your crisis team. Next, we'll move on to policies, procedures, and protocols. Again, things to consider. Communications protocols, you've got to determine how are you going to gather information, what sources are you going to use to receive information, and what sources are you going to use to distribute it. We'll get into that a little bit further, but it's more than just calling a press conference. There's so much more to crisis communications than just calling a press conference. Documentation. Documentation can be vitally important because in many instances, FEMA will not reimburse a penny of what you may spend if you can't prove you really did spend it on the purpose for which FEMA is willing to pay. So you want to make sure that you document your expenses. Public records, can't emphasize this one enough. It's so easy when the adrenaline gets flowing to dash off a quick note to someone and not think too much about how you're wording things. If you're doing it from a city account, it's a public record. If you're not doing it from a city account, it may well be a public record anyhow if it's in furtherance of your official functions. And there will come a point where somebody, some reporter somewhere is going to ask to see the email correspondence or get the 911 tapes or city records dating back on, maintenance records, any number of things. So you've got to factor that in and figure out how you're going to deal with it when it does happen. As we talked about with law enforcement and legal and compliance, that's important to figure out who will be a part of the team, but it's also important to determine how is that going to be addressed? How is that going to be factored into the planning you do and the steps you take during the actual crisis? Finally, coordination with other entities. You need to know how are you going to communicate, who are you going to communicate with, and what's going to trigger the decisions to talk to people outside of your own city. Quite frankly, it's a question of when do you decide, this is something that's bigger than we can handle, we need help, or that needs a specialized piece of equipment, we don't have it, but the next city over does, can we borrow it from them? Things along those lines. Again, we're not here today to tell you who to call and how to call them, but these are things you need to deal with and address as you put together a crisis communications plan.
One of the important exercises that will be part of putting a crisis communication plan together is really having a thoughtful conversation with your team about who your target audiences might be in any kind of crisis. This is something that's best not done seat of the pants when a crisis occurs, although there may be some unique audiences that need to be addressed later depending on the particular crisis, but it's extremely helpful within your crisis plan to think through each one of those audiences and think about what kind of information they might need, what role they might play in sharing information, who the best messengers are to get information to them and to get their buy-in in being helpful in a crisis. And so one of the most important audiences, of course, is your internal audience, your city employees. Thinking through what role they will play, how you will keep them informed, what you expect of them. For instance, where to channel media calls. If you don't want to have 100 voices speaking for the city, which I'm sure you don't, having a protocol so that your employees know what they can and can't do and say on their own personal social media platforms or as a representative of the city. And then, of course, your constituents, how you're going to get information out to them, and who the separate, unique constituent groups are that will need information in a crisis. For instance, disabled residents. Who are some of the partner organizations that could be very valuable in helping to message to that population? Having the availability of a sign language interpreter, for instance, to be able to message to deaf constituents. If you have a large elderly population that may need help with evacuation or other services during a crisis, having a plan in place to message to them and to meet their needs. John mentioned earlier, if you're a college town and you have a big college population, how you're going to communicate with that unique audience and what potential messengers could help you get their attention. Then if there are victims of the crisis, how you're going to communicate with them and their families, and who would deliver that communication. That obviously would need to be handled very deftly, very sensitively. For instance, if you have law enforcement casualties, making sure that someone within the ranks is communicating with their families and sharing the city's concern and compassion is very important. And then, you've got your media that you deal with on a regular basis, your local media where you have everyday relationships, but in a high-level crisis, you could immediately become a focal point of national media and international media that can become very difficult to manage. So thinking through that and thinking through the choice of spokespeople and how you will deal with the media to keep them regularly updated so that they see you as the trusted source of information rather than sharing a lot of unverified information from questionable sources. As John mentioned too, other government agencies at the state and federal level, other affected cities, having someone designated with the role of coordinating, and it may be multiple people who are part of your crisis team, but coordinating with those partners to make sure that they get timely information, and if it's appropriate for them to have information before it's released to the public or to the media, making sure that you're following protocols to share information at the appropriate time. So a message map is a tool that can be very valuable for coordinating your points and getting everyone who's speaking on the same script. And in a crisis, you may very well have a different message map for each of those most important audiences. A message map typically consists of an overarching message, up to 3 supporting messages, and then your facts or your proof points that demonstrate that your message is true, that you're credible, and that you can be believed. So just to give you an example, an overarching message or an umbrella message might be, the city is working to restore power and we'll keep everyone updated as we have more information. Your supporting messages under that might be something like, our citizens' safety and well-being is our top priority. We are working to restore power as quickly as possible. We are taking steps to prevent a future outage. And then the proof points that would show, for instance, that citizen safety and well-being is a priority could be things like, we've activated emergency generators to make sure our emergency dispatch center can continue to receive calls for help. Or we've brought in additional staff to assist with traffic management because a large number of traffic lights are currently not functioning. Or we've released a checklist of household appliances to turn off to avoid fire when power comes back on. Or we've deployed additional law enforcement officers to patrol the business district and prevent looting. Each of those action steps or facts show that the supporting message that our citizen safety and well-being is our top priority is true, and we have the facts to back it up. Taking the time as a team to think through your main message, your supporting messages, and your proof points will really help you avoid missteps, will help you stick to your script during media interviews, will help you figure out what your call center ought to be saying, and it's well worth the time to put that in place even in a fast-moving crisis. And then inventorying your messaging channels. Again, you know how you get information out to constituents, but in your crisis plan, you should catalog all of those messaging channels and think through how you would use them in different types of crises. For instance, you have your website. Your website is probably a central place people will go for information in a developing crisis. But in addition to your website, your department's websites, your partner organizations' websites are also platforms where information needs to be coordinated and put out in a comprehensive way. The news media is, of course, the most rapid-fire way of getting information out, and it will be expected that you will provide regular briefings to the media to share information as you know it. We'll talk about social media a little bit later in the webinar, but your social media platforms as the city, but also your departments. I mean, it may be that your Parks and Rec department has its own Twitter or its own Facebook page, and depending on the type of developing crisis, that would also be an appropriate place to say, here's how you can pick up your children, for instance, in an emergency situation, or other information that particular constituent groups would turn to. And then your local access channel is another place where you can provide rebroadcasts of news conferences, you can provide updated information. And of course, don't forget your voicemail and your citizen call center.
I mentioned earlier a little bit about command center idea. This is important. There are some unique facets to a command center type operation related specifically to the communications function, because it has to be a place where both the city communications team has room to work, access to the information they need, and the space to think. But at the same time, it also is going to become the focal point for the media. And so you want to find some place that's as centrally located as possible. And again, in many instances, this may be at City Hall or at an emergency operations center, but not always. So you want to give some thought to that. You need the workspace and resources. You want to make sure that, well, the last thing you want is to show up for convene your crisis response team and whoever's running the show says, all right, somebody take notes, and everybody looks around and no one has a pen or a notepad. You want to make sure that there is a supply of those. And I know it sounds silly, but if you get deployed in a hurry, you may not think to grab it. You get to your car, you're on your way in to report, and you figure, well, somebody will have it. Well, if everybody thinks like that, you're not going to have it. So you want to make sure that you have a supply of those things. And dry erase boards or whatever, and also the means to access the flow of information that's going on around you. You want to have, if you have a media briefing room, you want to make sure that you have access to it from the command center. You want to have a convenient way in and out so that ideally you don't have to walk through the reporters in order to get to the podium, because that means you're also going to have to walk through them on your way out after you've decided you're done saying what you need to say. And vitally important, of course, is that you have privacy. You don't want the media or the public or any interested party listening in while you're having your strategy discussions or your discussions where some of what you're talking about may be information that's not yet ready to go public. So these, again, are things that you need to consider as you identify the place that will be your central command center. Now, we're going to move on to a discussion of template responses, which often falls under the umbrella term of holding statements. It's a little more than that. But the key thing is that when a crisis hits, the city wants to and needs to be able to put out a message as quickly as possible. You want to get ahead of the news. You want to be the source of information. You want to tell your story on your terms, on your turf, rather than having someone else put it out without the benefit of necessarily or the encumbrance of accuracy. And so several tactics that we always try to recommend are shown on the screen there: holding statements, initial press releases, response emails, and public records request responses. What this basically means is you're essentially putting together brief, fill-in-the-blank messages that provide the essential startup job of conveying the message to the public: we're on it, we're dealing with it, we're aware of what's going on, and we are addressing it as best we can. In the fill-in-the-blank model, you would essentially identify, fill those blanks in with some of the particulars of the event itself, but the idea is to have something ready so that you don't have to spend the first minutes or hour or two of the crisis response figuring out what should we say. You've already decided what it is you should say. It may not provide a lot of information, but it at least gets you on the record with what you can say and the promise that you'll say more when you know it. So let's take a look at a few example holding statements that can give you an idea of what we're talking about.
A cardinal rule of our business that we tell all of our clients is to never say no comment.
Never, ever, ever.
and we often get pushback when people say, but we don't have the facts yet, we don't know anything. nothing that we have to say, so we need to avoid the media until we know more. Well, that's not true. You want to establish yourself as the trusted source of information. You want to start gaining the public's confidence and that you are the authority and control of the situation. So a holding statement can be a very useful way to do that, even when you really don't have much to say. Here are a few examples of what a holding statement might be. We have crews at the scene, and we've implemented our response, our emergency response plan. We don't have details of what happened yet, but I can assure you that safety is our top priority, and we're all doing what we can to ensure public safety. As we know more, we will let you know more. We'll do another briefing in 2 hours.
And let me point out, that statement doesn't guarantee public safety. It just says we're doing all we can to assure it, and that's all you can really do at a time like that. But it's important to at least strike that tone of reassurance.
And these are template statements that can be put together in advance, can be part of your crisis plan, because your primary communication director could be on vacation in Belize when a crisis hits. So having materials that could go to somebody who is less seasoned and less familiar to step into that role and provide appropriate direction is what the crisis plan does for you. Of course, one of the central jobs in a crisis is responding to the onslaught of news media that can be very aggressive, that, as you know, now operate on a 24/7 clock. It's no longer, well, we have a 5 o'clock deadline and you'll see it in tomorrow's newspaper. So it's very important to make sure that you have the right spokesperson or spokespeople, that they are prepared, that you've taken the time before you get in front of the bank of cameras to think through your messaging, at least having bullet points together, and to have the discipline to stick to that message as opposed to answering any question that's asked, having your message to bridge back to if you either can't or don't want to answer the question that's asked.
And that's where that message map can be such a vital tool to you. You wouldn't necessarily have it in front of you as a guide, but having those key points and key supporting statements in your head can really help you stay on message.
Your crisis plan would also detail your approval process. So who needs to see a statement or a press release before it goes out? Having up-to-date media lists so that you can quickly get information out to key media in a developing situation. Being responsive to deadlines, asking reporters when they're filing their story, which, as I said, nowadays it's a race to instant news distribution. So you have to be prepared to respond quickly, at least with a holding statement. And then never speculating or saying more than you know, but having a process in place internally to get the facts, and then a regular briefing system to make sure that you are sharing it with reporters in a timely fashion so that they know that, that you will be a reliable source as they develop the story.
All right, now let's talk a little bit about social media. That it's an unavoidable and essential resource. I'm not going to read you everything that's on that slide, but two things I do want to mention is the third bullet there, make sure all social media usernames and passwords are easily accessible. What we mean by that is the city is going to have a number of Facebook accounts, different departments, Twitter handles, if you use other social media resources as well. Your crisis communications coordinator needs to be able to utilize any of those, and that means having the right login information. It won't do you any good to have all these possible outlets if you can't access them. And so you want to keep an up-to-date list of those so that if you do need to use them, again, if the person who actually who normally posts things onto the Parks and Recreation Department's Twitter account is off that day or sick or on vacation, you still need to be able to add a resource. The other thing I want to point out about social media is the value of it and the risk of it is that it's a two-way street. It's great to let you put out information, but it also receives information, and some of that is accurate, some of it's not. So social media out in the community where things are happening can really key you into what's going on. It can provide information to you sometimes before you'll find out about it otherwise. But just because you're getting the information doesn't mean it's accurate. We all know that social media is not particularly the source of all accurate knowledge and wisdom. So you've got to monitor it, you've got to stay on top of it, but you've also got to be mindful of the fact that you can't feel compelled to respond to everything and anything, because A, it may not be accurate, or B, it may divert you and distract you from what you really need to be doing. But it's got to be something that you take into account. I want to take a quick look at a video of how social media can be utilized and not always to the best result.
Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Diane McInerney, in today for Jeffrey Oracle. Heartbreak across America today over the deadliest attack on law enforcement since 9/11. The nation watched in horror as the mass shooting in Dallas played out, not only in news footage, but in images captured by shocked witnesses on their cell phones. After the protest last night, just before the 9 o'clock hour, and during the chaos that ensued after the gunfire broke out, Dallas police thought they had a person of interest. They called this person a suspect via their Twitter account, but turns out they had the wrong guy.
The world saw him as a mass murderer. Why? Because he was a black man who was carrying a gun.
That's a good example of how you can cause problems if you don't have the correct information. And so you want to make sure you want to put information out. You want to ask the public to assist you, but you've got to make sure you're on solid footing with it.
Very quickly, because we do want to leave time for questions and answers, I think we talked about the importance of the public records law and sunshine during a crisis. That applies to text messages. It applies to informal documents. And so you just want to make sure you're keeping a complete record so that you can be responsive to public records requests no matter what door they come in through. And then your crisis plan should include checklists for all the things that you might need to deploy in a crisis, like, for instance, for a news conference, your media lists, your logistical needs, your podium and AV and Multbox. Just don't leave it to yourself to scramble and think through what the steps are for any activation during a crisis, but include in your plan a checklist for every one of those protocols and steps so that it's available to you and serves as your guide in a crisis.
And finally, we'll mention the importance of keeping your plan updated. Getting a good comprehensive plan is essential, but it won't do you much good if it's out of date. So you've got to make sure that it adapts to, that it's updated to adapt to changes in city government structure or personnel. You want to make sure that it remains accessible to you. You want to make sure that your list of media contacts remains current, and that all the policies, procedures, and protocols remain current as well.
And changes in social media. For instance, now you can live stream a news conference through Facebook. So as those new tools become available, you want to think through how you would use them and include them in your checklist and in your crisis plan.
Right. Now we'll turn to your questions, but again, we want to emphasize the value of this FLCityGuard.com website. It's a tremendous resource. Every city has access to it. If you don't have login information, I know that the communications office at the Florida League of Cities can provide that to you, so just contact them for that. But it really can be an effective guide to let you have a good idea of some of the things you need to be doing, and there's a pretty fair amount of how-to stuff in there. And with that, we'll answer any questions that might have come in.
Sure. I'm going to take the first one. It's just is the webinar being recorded and will it be posted on the website? The answer to that is yes, that this entire webinar is being recorded. It will be on the website within 24 hours, and a link to view it will be emailed to all registered participants for today's call, as well as a copy of the slides. The next one is about social media. It is, do you recommend using a specific crisis hashtag for monitoring and or engaging with the public via social media?
Hashtags are always a good idea in that they put all the eggs in the same basket, but the trick is getting the word out so that everybody uses it. Yes, the answer would be yes, but don't rely solely on that. You've got to keep your antenna up for every other possibility too, because some people simply don't utilize hashtags very effectively.
And it may be that there is a hashtag that emerges organically from the public, and if that occurs, you want to be also using that to make sure that you're communicating with those people who are turning to that hashtag for their information.
We've got another question that came in, and I'll read it and let Michelle answer it. You talked about holding statements. Wouldn't it make more sense to wait until the crisis hits so you know the specifics of the crisis?
The whole point of a crisis plan is to allow you to move more quickly and with fewer missteps. So the benefit of having some kind of generic holding statements built into your plan is that it allows you to step up to the podium very quickly in the immediate minutes after a crisis. Yes, you're going to have to customize all of your messaging as the facts come in, but believe me, having been in many crisis situations, to the extent you've thought things through in advance and have materials at the ready, you will be very well served and better able to manage that crisis.
The reality is that things you know like the back of your hand have a way of escaping you when the adrenaline gets flowing and 18 different things are happening at the same time. The whole idea of the plan is so that you don't have to remember to do certain things. It's right there for you.
Thank you. We have time for another question. How often should a plan be updated?
We would recommend that you look at your plan, read it through every 6 months to make sure that it's current, and that the crisis team come together to talk about that and even do some simulations or some exercises to see what it would be like to deploy in a crisis. One of the training tools that we have presented through CityGuard are tabletop exercises that have so far been conducted in North Florida and Central Florida. There will be a third one in South Florida later, where for the group that comes together, and I would encourage all of you to be a part of that free training, we will pose a crisis situation to the group, and you will have the real-life exercise of deploying. That would be a great learning experience, and it's the sort of thing you can also do with your team in your city.
Finally, let me just say that, as Michelle said, pull out the plan every 6 months, and if you pull it out and realize it's been sitting on the shelf untouched for those 6 months, that's the opportunity for you to consider yourself very lucky that you haven't needed it during the previous 6 months, because we opened with it and I'll close with it. It's going to happen. You don't know when. It is going to happen, and you may think your town is too small, too quiet. Other cities have thought the same thing, and right up until the moment where they find themselves on the network news. So with that, we want to thank you and turn it back over.
I just want to thank both of our presenters in Sachs Media Group for being a partner with the Florida League of FLC University and CityGuard. As we mentioned, the recording will be available on the website, and everyone who participated today will be receiving a link to the webcast. And with that, thank you, everyone.